The auction at Cold Spring Landing lasted 4 minutes, and for 3 of them the men along the riverbank laughed at her. It was the spring of 1887 in the Idaho Territory where the Snake River came down out of the high desert and slowed against a mudflat that the freighters had used and then forgotten. A shack stood half in the water there, leaning on rotten pilings, its roof gone green with moss and its door swollen shut by 30 years of weather. The county had seized it for unpaid back taxes, and the clerk, who read the lot aloud, could not keep the amusement out of his voice. Nobody wanted a drowned cabin on a dying landing. Nobody bid. And then a girl with no shoes worth the name, and a coat 2 sizes too large, raised one finger and offered a single silver dollar, and the clerk, to be rid of the lot in the morning, struck it down to her before anyone thought to stop laughing. Her name was Etta Vane. She had turned 18 that winter, and she had been put out of her uncle's house in March with a satchel and a coat and the address of a landing she had never seen. She stood at the edge of the small crowd while the laughing went on, a tall freighter near her shaking his head and telling the man beside him that the girl had just bought herself a place to drown, standing up. Another said she could pole the thing downriver and sell it to the fish. She did not turn to look at them. She kept her eyes on the leaning shack out on the flat, on the green roof, and the swollen door, and the pilings black with 30 years of river wash, and she let the men have their morning. The clerk counted her single dollar twice, as if a second look might turn it into something worth the bother, and then he wrote her name in the ledger, in a hand that did not trouble to be neat. He told her the lot came, as it stood, that the county made no promise the floor would hold her weight, and that he hoped she had not spent her last coin on a roof for the muskrats. She took the deed paper from him and folded it once, and put it away without a word, and the clerk, who had expected at least an argument, found he had nothing further to say. What the men on the bank did not know, what she had told no one, was that she had not come to the river by accident, and that she knew exactly what stood inside the swollen door, because the man who built it had taught her how to read a thing nobody else could. Stay with her a while, because the dollar she paid that morning was the smallest number in a story that would settle a debt 30 years old. To understand why a girl would spend her last coin on a ruin, you have to go back to the man who raised the half of her that mattered. His name was Amos Kettle, and he had been a riverman and a joiner both, a builder of the flat-bottomed scows that hauled freight when the railroads had not yet reached the Upper Snake. He was her grandmother's brother, an old bachelor with sawdust in the creases of his hands. And when Etta's mother died and her father drifted off down some other river, it was Amos who took the child in and set her on a stool in his shop and taught her the only catechism he knew. Wood remembers, he told her. It holds the shape of every hand that worked it. Learn to read the grain, and a board will tell you who made it, when, and what he was hiding. She had been 7 when he first set her hands on a plane, and she had hated it at first, the way the iron caught and tore the grain when she pushed too hard. Go with it, not against it, he said, and put his rough hand over hers and slowed her down until the shaving came off whole and curled, and the surface beneath it shone. A board has a direction it wants to be worked, he told her. So does most everything else. The trouble in the world is folks forcing the grain. She learned to find the lay of a board by closing her eyes and running her thumb both ways along it, and by the time she was 12 she could name the tree a plank had come from by the smell of the fresh cut and the weight of it in her 2 hands. He taught her joints, next the dovetail, and the mortise and the wedge tenon, and he taught her that a joint cut true needs no nail and no glue, that the wood itself will hold the wood if you understand the grain of both pieces. The best lock in the world, he said, is one nobody can see is a lock. He died when she was 16 of a cough that took him slow through one long winter, and her uncle, who was her father's brother and a hard small man, took her in the way one takes in a debt. For 2 years she cooked and scrubbed and was reminded daily of the cost of her bread, Then her uncle found a wife who did not want another woman's child under the roof, and Etta was told to go. She went without weeping, because Amos had taught her that too. "A thing that breaks loud is a thing that was built wrong," he said. "The good joints give quiet." There was one more thing Amos had told her before he died, one promise he had made her swear to keep. He had told her about the shack at Cold Spring Landing. He had built it himself in the winter of 1857, 30 years before she would buy it. He had built it for a man named Harlan Rowe, a freight agent who paid Amos to put up a strong room on the water, where bullion and coin from the upper diggings could wait safe for the downriver boats. Rowe had wanted iron, Amos told her, a great safe hauled up at ruinous cost, but Amos had talked him out of it. "Iron rusts and announces itself," he said, "and a safe tells every thief in the country that something is worth stealing. Build it in wood, and build it secret, and no man who is not told will ever know there is a room beneath the room." So Amos built it well, with a false floor, and a chamber beneath the water line lined in oiled cedar, and he fitted the whole of it with joints that locked from the inside in a sequence only the builder knew, a set of plank toggles and bridge pieces that would bind solid against a pry bar and open like a held hand to the one who knew the order. He was proud of it. It was the finest thing he ever made, and it was the thing he came to regret most in his life. That same winter something had happened at the landing that Amos would not fully describe, except to say that good men had been cheated and one had died, and that the proof of it had gone into the chamber he built and the door had been shut and Harlan Rowe had ridden away a wealthy man. He told her he had wanted to speak then and had not. He had a shop to keep and no money to fight a man with a bank behind him, and he had told himself it was not his quarrel, that he had only built the box and not filled it. He had been wrong, he said, and he had known he was wrong for 30 years, and he was too old now to walk back upriver and set it right himself. Amos had carried that for 30 years. He had never gone back. The guilt of it, of having built the box that held a stolen thing, had sat in him like a splinter too deep to dig out. On his deathbed he gave it to Etta, the way a man hands off a tool he can no longer lift. "Find what is under the floor," he said, "and give it back to the people it was taken from. The locks will open for you. I taught your hands the order." So she had come, not for treasure, though the men laughing on the bank assumed it. She had come to keep a promise to a dead man, and to read a thing that had been waiting 30 years for the one pair of hands that could. The morning after the auction, Etta walked the half-mile of mud out to the shack alone. The county clerk had given her a paper, deeding her the lot, and a look that said he expected her to be gone by week's end. She tucked the paper into the leather satchel that had been Amos's, the one with the worn brass buckle and the smell of cedar still in it, and she set her hand against the swollen door and felt the wood the way he had taught her, with the flat of her palm and a long patience. The door would not open by force, and she did not try. She knelt instead and ran her fingers along the lower frame until she found what she was looking for, a peg of hardwood set flush into the sill, almost invisible under the moss. Amos had described it to her a dozen times sitting up in his bed that last winter, with his hands moving in the air as though the shack stood before him. The first key, he called it. She drew her knife and worked the moss away and cleaned the head of the peg until she could see the faint cross grain Amos had cut into it so his own hand would find it in the dark, and she pressed the peg in a slow quarter turn, and somewhere inside the wall a wooden bar slid in its groove with a sound like a held breath let go. The door eased outward an inch on its own weight. 30 years of swollen silence gave way to one quiet click, and the river air went into the dark where no air had moved since 1857. She did not go in that first day. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust and looked at what Amos had made, and she understood for the first time that he had been a better builder than the world ever knew. He had told her it was the finest thing he made, and she had taken it as an old man's fondness for his own work. Standing in the doorway, she saw he had been telling her plain fact. Everything around the center had gone to ruin, the walls black and soft, the window frames sprung, the river taking back what it could reach. The center had not moved. He had built the heart of the thing to outlast the rest of it, the way a man builds when he means a secret to keep. The single room was bare and rotted along the walls where the river had reached, but the floor at the center stood dry and sound, planked in cedar that had outlasted everything around it. There was a table, fallen on its side. There was an iron stove gone entirely to rust, and there was set into the floor where the planks ran crosswise instead of long, the seam of a hatch so cunningly fitted that a man could have walked over it for a lifetime and never seen it. Etta saw it at once because she knew to look for the place where the grain told a small lie. She gave herself 3 days to do it right. She had $4 left after the shack and her supper, and she spent one of them on a sack of meal and a length of rope and the loan of a lantern from the widow who kept the landing's only standing house. Her name was Mrs. Dam Goss, and she was a weathered woman of perhaps 60 who had buried a husband and 2 sons and run the freight stop alone for 20 years. And she watched the girl across her counter with the flat, assessing look of someone who had learned to take the measure of strangers fast. When Etta told her plainly that she meant to open the old row shack, the widow's hand stopped on the lantern she was passing over. She looked at the girl a long moment and said only that she had been a girl herself when that place was shut, and that she remembered the winter it happened, and that some folks at the landing had never stopped wondering. She did not ask why a stranger of 18 had come so far to open a drowned ruin. She only let go of the lantern and said the girl should mind the rotten pilings on the north side, and watched her go out into the mud with a look that was not quite pity and not quite hope. What folks wondered, Mrs. I. Goss said, was where the Dawson money went. And there was the first thread of the thing Amos had carried, Tea. Etta sat in the widow's kitchen that evening, a low room that smelled of wood smoke and tallow, with the river loud through the chinking. And she listened, and the old woman told it slow, the way a thing is told that has been turned over many times in the dark. In the winter of 1857, a party of placer miners had come down from the Upper Snake with the season's washings. A company of 9 men who had worked a claim together all summer and meant to bank the gold downriver and split it fair. They had stored it at Rowe's strong room to wait out the ice, and they had been glad to find a man who would keep it safe and give them a paper for it, because the high water and the road agents made the downriver run a hard gamble in the spring thaw. Their foreman was a man named Eli Dawson, steady and well-liked, a carpenter by his first trade, who had come west for the diggings, with a wife and a daughter waiting at a homestead upriver. In the spring, when the ice broke and the men came back for their gold, the strong room stood empty, and Harlan Rowe swore on a stack of ledgers that no gold had ever been deposited, that the miners were drunkards misremembering their own poverty, and he had the paper to prove it. There was no receipt. Rowe had seen to that, the widow said. The men had trusted a handshake and a promise of a paper that never came. And against the word of a man with a bank ledger, the word of 9 ragged miners weighed nothing at all. Eli Dawson stood in the store and named Rowe a thief in front of the whole landing, and Rowe only looked at him, calm as still water, and asked where his receipt was, and there was none. And the men in the store, who had been Dawson's friends, looked at their boots. Ruined and called a liar, Dawson went out on the ice that broke under him a week later, and whether he fell or walked the landing never agreed. His wife lost the homestead within the year. His daughter was sent to relatives downriver, and the landing lost track of her. And Harlan Rowe sold his interest at Cold Spring and moved to Lewiston, and became in time a respectable man with a bank and a name and a pew at the front of the church. Etta listened to all of it without a word, and when Mrs. Goss finished, the girl said one thing. She said that her Uncle Amos had built that strong room, and that he had told her the gold had never left it. The widow set down her cup. The next morning Etta went back out to the shack, with the lantern and the rope and a small pry bar from Amos's satchel, and she began the work that was the whole reason she had come. She did not pry at the hatch. Amos had warned her that the false floor was rigged to bind if it was forced, that the cedar boards would swell against hidden cleats and lock a fool out forever. There was an order to it, and the order was the key. She knelt at the seam and counted the planks from the north wall because Amos had told her to count from the cold side, and at the fourth plank she pressed down at the near end and felt the far end rise the width of a finger. Beneath it was a wooden toggle, swollen but sound, and she turned it a half-turn against the grain and heard a click. Then the seventh plank, lifted the same way, and a second toggle, turned the other direction. Then the bridge plank between them, which would not lift until the first two were set, and now lifted clean away in her two hands, and below it, in the lantern light she saw the iron ring of the hatch itself, oiled and unrusted, sealed in cedar that had kept the water out for 30 years. She sat back on her heels and looked at it a long moment. There was a part of her that had not believed, all the way down, that it would be real. Her uncle's voice was in her, still the low certainty that she was a fool and a burden, and the men on the bank had only said the same thing louder. A girl raised to be told she was wrong learns to brace for the floor to give way under whatever she trusts. The floor had not given way. The toggles had turned in the order a dead man taught her, exactly as he said they would, and the proof of him sat there in the lamplight, oiled iron and living cedar, waiting. She set her blistered palm flat against the wood, and left it there a moment, the way she had learned to greet a board before she worked it, and then she took up the ring. It took her the rest of that day to raise the hatch, not because the lock resisted, but because the wood had to be coaxed, eased, persuaded the way Amos eased. Every joint he ever fitted, she worked the ring a quarter turn and waited. She worked it another quarter and waited. Twice the swollen cedar caught, and she stopped and ran her palm flat across it and felt for where it bound and worked the pry bar there, gently, until the bind let go. The river slapped the pilings outside, the lantern guttered, and she trimmed it, her hands cramped, and she opened and closed them and went on. And near dark, with her hands blistered through and her arms shaking, she felt the hatch break its long seal and rise, and a smell came up out of the chamber that she would remember the rest of her life. It was the smell of cold cedar and oiled iron and air that had not been breathed since before she was born. She lowered the lantern into the dark, and she saw what Eli Dawson's 9 men had been called liars for. Stacked on a cedar shelf below the waterline, dry and untouched, were 31 small canvas sacks, each tied at the neck with waxed cord, each stamped with the assay mark of the upper diggings. The cord had not rotted. The cedar oil had done its work, and the chamber had stayed dry as a seed pod through 30 spring floods, and the gold lay there exactly as 9 men had laid it up against a spring they never saw. Set among them, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, was a ledger book and a bundle of papers, and Etta drew the bundle up first, before the gold, because the gold was only metal, and the paper was the thing Amos had truly hidden. She unwound the oilcloth with hands that had stopped shaking and gone very still. On the topmost page, in a careful hand, was a deposit record signed and witnessed, listing 9 names and the weight each man had laid up against the spring. Harlan Rowe had sworn no such record existed. Amos had kept the copy. He had made Rowe sign 2, the way an honest joiner makes 2 pegs where one would serve, and he had hidden the second beneath the floor he built, and for 30 years it had waited in the dark for a hand that knew the order of the locks. Etta did not shout. She knelt at the lip of the open hatch and she read the 9 names by lantern light, slowly, the way you read the names on stones. Eli Dawson stood at the top, and beside his name the largest weight of any, for he had been foreman, and his summer's share was the heaviest. She read each name down to the last, men she had never met and never would, and she understood then that Amos had not sent her for the gold at all. He had sent her for the names. She brought up one sack, to be sure, and opened it, and let the lantern fall on what was inside, and it was gold, fine river gold, gone soft and yellow in the light, more of it than the girl had ever seen or imagined. She held a little of it in her palm and let it run back into the sack, cold from 30 years below the waterline, and she felt no pull toward it at all, which surprised her a little, and then did not. She tied the sack shut again and lowered it back into the cold where it had waited, and she climbed out of the chamber and sat in the doorway of the shack with the ledger in her lap and watched the river go dark, and she did the arithmetic that Amos had set for her 30 years before. The gold was not hers. She had known that before. She paid her $1. A man had died called a thief above this gold, and a woman had been driven off her land, and a child had been sent away to grow up ashamed of her own name, and none of that could be bought back with the metal that caused it. What could be bought back was the name. The gold belonged to 9 families. The truth belonged to all of them, and to the dead, and to a place that had been wrong for 30 years and did not yet know it. Now, before the rest of it, sit with the question the river set her. A whole settlement had decided that 9 men were liars, and one was a fool who drowned for his lies. What does it cost a place to be wrong for 30 years, and what does it cost to be made right? She turned it over a long time in the dark, and then she went to work on the only part of the answer she could build. She did not go to the county, she did not go to a judge or a marshal, and she did not ride down river to confront Harlan Rowe, who was old now and rich and beyond the reach of any shame she could bring him. Amos had taught her that you do not fix a wrong by breaking something else. You fix it the way you fix a house, from the sill up one true joint at a time. So she began with the names. Mrs. Goss knew the country, and over the next weeks she helped Etta trace what had become of the 9. They sat many evenings at the widow's table with a stub of pencil and the backs of old freight bills, and the old woman dredged her memory for where each man had gone after the ruin, who had a brother in the Palouse, who had drunk himself into a pauper's grave at Lewiston, who had simply walked west one morning and not come back. 3 of the men were dead, with no kin anyone could find. 2 had moved on so far that no letter would reach them. 4, though, had families still within 100 miles, scattered and poor and carrying the old shame like a coat they could not take off. And one of those 4 was the family of Eli Dawson himself. His daughter had not vanished after all. She had married a fence builder named Calloway, and lived 2 days' ride to the east, in a sod house on a dry claim, a woman of perhaps 40 now, with children of her own, and a name the country had taught her to be ashamed of. Etta wrote to her by lamplight, and tore up 2 letters before she was satisfied with the 3rd, because there was a way to say a thing that was too large to say plainly, and a way to say it that left a person room to stand. She did not write that there was gold. She wrote that she had Amos Kettle's deposit ledger from the Rowe strong room, signed and witnessed, and that it listed Eli Dawson's full deposit, and that the people who had called him a liar had been wrong. She sent the letter east with a freighter who was passing that way, and then there was nothing to do but wait, and she filled the waiting with work, and watched the road. The woman came herself. She came in a borrowed wagon with her eldest boy driving, a lean boy of 14 who held the reins too tight, and she climbed down stiff from the long road and looked out at the leaning shack on the flat, as though it were a grave she had been told of, but never found. She walked the half-mile of mud out to where her father's gold had lain while her family lost everything, her hem heavy with the wet, and she stood in the doorway where Etta had stood, and for a moment she could not make herself step inside. Etta did not hurry her. She brought the ledger out into the light of the doorway and put it into the woman's hands and turned it to the line with her father's name on it, the weight beside it in Amos's witnessing hand and Harlan Rowe's own signature at the foot of the page. The woman, whose name was Sarah Calloway, read it 3 times. She did not weep at first. She ran her finger under the name the way you touch a thing to be sure it is real, And then she said, in a voice gone rough, that her mother had died still hearing the men in the store fall silent when she came in, still feeling the way a room cooled when a Dawson entered it. She said she had been 11. The spring they took her down river, that she remembered her father's hands more than his face now, and that she had spent her whole life believing he had stolen from his own friends and shamed them all to death, that she had taught herself not to speak his name because of what people did with their eyes when she did. And here in a dead man's ledger was the proof, 30 years late, that he had told the truth from the first, that he had been exactly the man she had been too ashamed to remember loving. That was when she wept, standing in the doorway with the ledger held to her chest, and Etta led her and did not say a word because there was nothing to add to it. The boy stood a little apart in the mud, looking at his mother and not understanding yet, and the river ran on past the three of them the way it had run past everything. The settling of the rest took the better part of a year, and Etta did it carefully and without noise. She brought a county surveyor and a man of law she trusted to the shack and had them witness the chamber as it stood, the gold and the ledger together, before a single sack was moved, so that no one could ever again say the deposit was a drunkard's dream. They lay on their bellies at the lip of the hatch with the lantern lowered and counted the sacks aloud, 31, and read the assay marks, and the surveyor wrote it all down in a fair hand and signed it, and had Etta and the lawyer sign beneath. The assay marks matched the ledger weights to the ounce. The signature on the deposit record was Harlan Rowe's own, and a clerk who had worked for Rowe in the old days, a stooped man brought up from Lewiston who had kept his silence 40 years out of fear of a powerful employer, looked at the page a long while and then said quietly that he had watched Rowe sign it, that he had been in the room, and that he had carried the lie ever since like a stone in his boot, and was glad at the last to set it down. There was no trial, because there was no one left to try who could be made to answer, but there did not need to be one. The paper did the work no accusation could have done. It was simply finally true, and a thing that is true and witnessed does not require a verdict to stand. The gold was divided as the ledger directed. The shares of the 3 dead men with no kin, and the 2 who could not be found, were held in trust by the county against any claim, set down in writing so that if a grandchild ever surfaced the money would be waiting. The rest went out to the 4 families who could be reached, carried in person, sack by sack, by a girl in an oversized coat who would take nothing for the carrying. She rode to each in turn over that long autumn, to a widow on a failing claim who had not known her husband had ever owned a thing worth keeping, to 2 grown sons of a man dead 20 years who stood in their dooryard and could not speak, to a one-armed miner gone gray who had been the youngest of the 9 and had spent his whole life half believing the others really had drunk the gold away. To each she gave the sacks, and a fair copy of the ledger page with their man's name on it, and she told them plainly what had been found and where, and she let them keep the page, because the page was worth more to them than the gold. Sarah Calloway's share was the largest because her father's deposit had been the largest, and she used it to buy back, acre by acre, a piece of the very homestead her mother had lost, and she put her father's name on the deed. She told Etta the day the deed was recorded that she meant to bury her mother's memory there in the spring, in the ground the woman had been driven off of, and that she would set a stone with Eli Dawson's name cut deep, where any man who had once looked away in a store could come and read it and know. Harlan Rowe heard of it downriver before the year was out. He was 81 and failing, a thin old man in a good house with his name on the bank and a pew at the front of the church, and word came up to him through a clerk that a ledger had surfaced at Cold Spring, signed in his own hand, witnessed, counted, and witnessed again. He understood, in the way the cornered finally do, that the foundation he had stood on for 30 years had been false the whole time and was gone now, kicked out from under him by a girl he had never met opening a door he had paid to have shut. For a single evening alone he knew what it was to be Eli Dawson standing in a store with the truth in his mouth and no paper in his hand, and to have no one believe him. He said nothing. There was nothing to say, and no one to say it to, and the men who might once have feared him were dead or did not care. He died that winter. The obituary in the Lewiston paper called him a pioneer of commerce, and not one person at Cold Spring Landing who knew the truth bothered to correct it, because the truth no longer needed his name to live. As for the men who had laughed at the auction, they came around the way small men do, slowly and without quite admitting it. By summer, there were those at the landing who had always known. They said that the Dawson gold was real, who had said so all along, who had never trusted Roe, not for a minute. Etta let them say it. She did not remind anyone of the laughing, did not remind the tall freighter that he had told the man beside him she had bought herself a place to drown standing up. Amos had taught her that vindication you have to announce is not vindication at all, only noise. The work had said it. She let the work stand. She did not leave the landing. With a small portion that the four families pressed on her against all her refusing, she bought the lot above the flood line and the standing house when Mrs. Goss grew too old to keep it, and she took up the old woman's trade of the freight stop, and in the back of it she set up a joiner's bench with Amos's tools laid out, in the order he had kept them, the planes by size, the chisels honed and rolled in oilcloth, the marking gauge he had made himself from a block of pear wood. She mended wagons and built scows and fitted doors that hung true and shut quiet, and she took the work no one else at the landing could do, the fine work, the work that asked for patience. More than one landing child learned at her bench to press a flat palm to a board and listen, and she taught them the way Amos had taught her, slow and without scolding, her hand over theirs until the shaving came off whole. The river went on past her door the way it always had. The shack on the mud flat she left standing, its hatch open to the air at last, and in time the cedar dried and the wood stopped binding, and it became a thing children rode out to see on still afternoons, the box that had kept the truth for 30 years. Sarah Calloway sent her a gift the second spring, a small thing wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected the ledger, carried up by the same freighter who had taken the first letter east. It was a wood plane, old and well used, with the initials E.D. burned into the heel of it. Eli Dawson had been a carpenter before he was a miner, the trade he carried west and meant to come home to, and it was the only tool of his that his daughter still had, kept through every move and every hungry winter, because it was the one thing of her father's that no one had been able to call into question. She wanted it to live on a working bench rather than a shelf. There was a note with it in the careful hand the girl knew now ran in that family, that said only that a tool ought to be where someone would use it, and that she could think of no better hands. Etta set it among Amos's tools where it belonged, and she used it, because a tool that is not used is only a memory, and she did not believe in keeping memories on shelves. On a still evening late in her first full year at the landing, Etta sat on the step of the house with the river running low and gold in the last of the light, and she took up Eli Dawson's plane and turned it over in her hands and felt the worn place where another set of hands had held it for years before hers. The grain of the handle had darkened where the thumb had ridden. She could read the man in it, the way Amos had promised her a board would always tell a steady hand, a man who finished what he started. A man! The wood said plainly, who had never in his life taken what was not his. She set the plane on the bench beside the cedar shavings of the day's work, and she banked the fire, and she sat a while longer in the doorway, listening to the water she had come to keep a promise beside. The $1 she had paid was long spent, and she had never once wished it back. The gold was in the right hands. The names had been read aloud at last to the people who needed to hear them, and a stone with one of them cut deep stood now on ground a family had been driven off of. And the worn plane sat in the lamplight on the bench, the last word in an argument that had taken 30 years to win, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, finally home. Did you ever carry a thing someone left you, not knowing what it would cost you to set it down where it belonged? Tell me about it. And if a story like this one is the kind you would sit with on a quiet evening, there are others waiting. Each about a thing the world threw away and a pair of hands patient enough to read it.